Okay, welcome to this forward plane session. Today we're going to talk about this book which I've written, but more generally we're going to talk about something called the forward plane, and so we're going to introduce a whole number of new things. But essentially, what we're going to talk about is something called metacognition, or thinking about thinking. And the title of the book is called First Invisible, Then Obvious, which really refers to the way ideas come to us, and particularly this invisibility, this what happens before the eureka moment and after the eureka moment, if you want. And generally, this is part of something called forward plane, which is essentially the secret science of ideas. Now, that's a grand title, but fundamentally, this is what it is. And this book one is Introduction to Forward Plane. There is a second book, which is book two. Now, just because it says introduction doesn't mean that it's lightweight. Actually, there's a tremendous amount of material and a tremendous amount of value in this book. So and in what we're going to cover today. So we're not going to cover the whole book, despite it being an introduction. For a full introduction, probably we're looking at 2 or 3 videos anyway. So what is forward plane? Well, at its root, forward plane is the result of an analysis where you say, well, hold on a second, it's a lot easier to work out what's going on in the field of ideas, in the way humans interact, if instead of having this amorphous bucket of approach of saying, well, the ideas just come in, come out, or whatever. If you say, well, we're going to separate what's going on a little bit here, and we're going to pay a lot of attention as to the way ideas come into play, come in, come out, come into vision, and the rest of it. And what forward plane is saying is essentially, you have we segregate the ideas coming in, and we call that back plane, and that's anything to do with reading, listening, hearing, understanding, and all this thing, watching YouTube, watching television, podcasts and the rest of it, listening to music, watching sports, and actually doing things, actually writing document, actually speaking, actually composing, actually coming up with a game strategy, actually coming up with something, and and we all do both, yeah. So some more or less, whatever. But essentially, there are different muscles. So there are to be able to do well with what we're going to discuss with forward plane, if you want, you need 2 things. You need to, on one hand, you need to, how to put it, you need to bear in mind, you need to have this idea of, we're going to separate these 2 things, back plane and forward plane. Initially, I fully understand that it is going to seem arbitrary and burdensome and unnecessary and strange and maybe even weird or repulsive. It can have any kind of reaction, but I'm not asking you to adopt the thought. What I'm saying is, like, well, hang on to the thoughts, let's park it, and the rest of it. So that's one thing. The second thought I would like to keep in the background throughout these discussions is that fundamentally we're not designed to understand forward plane. We're not designed to pick it up. We're not designed to really be aware of it. It's the fish discover the water last, and forward plane is not something we see. Having said these 2 things, so the item number 1, the fact that we segregate these 2 muscles, if you want, these 2 cognitive centers, and second is that, well, we're going to have to work against the flow. We're going to have to work against our nature. to do well. So let's take some examples of where, if we say, well, we've not, where is this coming from? Why do you spring that on us, and why is that relevant? Well, the reason it's relevant is when you focus correctly on the right muscle, and when you really get into it, then you will realize that there's, in a sense, it's like having a muscle that you've not used correctly your entire life. Or for much of your life, and sometimes you've used it, sometimes you've not used it, or perhaps that applies to other people, perhaps that applies to your children or your colleagues or your boss or anything, towards your client. So you will see this is very, very different, because in a sense we're fortunate because this is a brand new field. It's open season, if you want, and so it's very, very happy. The second thing we can talk about is say, well, how, give me some examples of when this happens, because you say, well, what evidence have you got to say? Well, sometimes you see it. So for instance, when you'll hear people saying, I can speak a bit of Spanish or French or German or whatever, foreign language, and they say, oh, but I can understand more than I can say. You see, I can speak a bit of Spanish, but I can understand more than I can say. Well, you see, you either know something or you don't know it. If there's one center, you either know something or you don't know it. So the only way you can both know and not know something is that if you accept that the theory of the separate cognitive centers. You say, well, what you're able to understand is one thing, that's one center, and then what you're able to say or to come up with or to write or whatever, that's another center. So that's one example. Let's take another example. Well, let's take a karaoke machine. So people know a song most of the time, and then they but they know it, but they don't know it. So that's another example. Okay, take another example. When people go to a thesaurus, they know it, but they don't. They go into a book, or nowadays it's a website, but to look for words that they already know. Now, you cannot both know and not know something if you've got one center. If you've got two centers, then it's a different thing altogether. So already we can see that there are distinctions. Now, the way I came across this is essentially, like many innovations, maybe discoveries. It was frustration, because essentially I was having breakfast with a colleague. And I arrived before him, so I was reading an article, and he came in and he asked me about the article, and I said that, and which I was reading, I was quite engrossed with, and I found it an interesting topic, some article about economics, and but I was not able to, I wasn't able to explain what it was, and I was deeply frustrated with that, and as happened before that, and this is what this little diagram is we were working on the project for a big pharmaceutical client here in the north of England, so out here in England, but in the north of England, and what happened is essentially I was staring in front of the machine, and I thought, well, what if the reason why I'm able to understand the article but not able to explain it very well is or at all in this instance, is simply that there are two centers, and I was quite young, and I was not particularly intellectually, I was relatively modest, so I went like, well, if there's one part which I've not spent much time training, because I never spent any time thinking about that. I never thought, let's call it, it wasn't called forward plane then. I got the name later because I was working with it more and more. But I went like, well, essentially I need to focus on these things because but also it was, I was working for a large engineering company, and there were loads of little instances where I could see that things weren't happening. Like I remember being in the discussion with a director, and was saying, like, people shouldn't be forgetting things. That's and I remember telling him, it's more interesting. It probably would be more interesting to understand why people remember things than why they forget them. And so he dismissed it, and he was like friendly guy, so there was not a problem. But so the question is, how do we remember things? Well, when we remember things, you see, it's forward plane. So from that point onwards, I started to spend more and more time working with forward plane, and I went like, until that point, I had spent a lot of time throughout my childhood, throughout education, school, university, and the rest of it. I was told, well, what you've got to do is you've got to understand. So you've got to learn and you've got to understand. So I practiced learning and understanding, but I didn't practice delivering because that was never particularly required of me, and I was doing a lot of sports. So I just did what I had to do to understand. But of course, if you stop at understanding, you stop mostly at backplane, really. So I hadn't really particularly placed any emphasis on forward plane. But from roughly that point onwards, as most sports person would do, you realize you've got a weakness in a domain, and what you do, well, you simply train on it. You just pick it up, and then you go all out with the training. By the way, the people who've done a lot of sports will understand completely what I'm trying to see there. You just maximize the amount of training. You just try and remove the excuses. You try and create the opportunities for training. You try and do it like every day, several times a day if you can. Any opportunity, anything, you just go like. You just try and make it happen, and I did, yeah. And things started to turn around, and from that point onwards, so what have we got here? So, and from that point onwards, I started to so I kind of wound up working with a financial company, an insurance company in the city in London. So I left engineering. Went into the city, and what's particularly interesting is that if you think about it, you be able to having awareness and understanding things is great, but really that's not what your bosses, your employer, your clients, your colleagues want. What they want you is they want you to be able to do things. Because if everybody just understands things, nothing much happens. So documents don't get prepared, products don't get created, sales pitches, the rest of it deliveries. So by focusing on forward plane, then things started to change. So I got a better job, and then things were going quite well. And all I did was really what I call simple backplane to forward plane transfer. So instead of just knowing something, whatever, you just make sure that you know it from the point of view you're able to replicate it. So if the proverbial sales manager would show up, then I would be able to tell him what's what. So there's. We can always understand a lot more than we can say. I mean, anyone who's read a book and tried to do a summary, or read a text and try and do a synthesis, or watched a movie and trying to do a synopsis, will know that this conversion thing, that's quite tricky, you see. But because so few people focus on that explicitly, you don't really have to do a huge amount to already start to stand out. I mean, so this is what was happening. So, and the beauty of it is that you can do it with a pen and paper. You simply need to learn to get good at replicating what you've picked up. Now I understand that might sound obvious to some people, and some people say, well, duh, it's what did you expect? And I completely understand that. And this is a legitimate comment, but not everybody is cut the same way. Not everybody, some people need more explicit instructions than others, and I certainly fall into the camp of people who need relatively explicit instructions for certain things. But hold that thought, because remember, we are in chapter 1 of 2 books. Okay, so there's a long way to go. Yes, because this is brand new. So this is what happens, but essentially this is what this introduction is about. There was a great incident when I was at university when I was playing team sport, and then the team captain wasn't around, so I was asked to do the team talk and the game plan, and I'd done dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of these game plans or whatever. Attended to them, but and I wasn't able to come up with anything. I remembered I was stymied. There was just nothing coming out, which was very, very strange. And so I fundamentally believe that we've got these two systems. Now they're merged and the rest of it. And this is the end of the first chapter. This is the best way to build forward plane is simply to transfer knowledge and concepts from backplane to forward plane, whether it's foreign language, whether it's mathematics, whether it's the products, whether it's anything to do with your works, with regulations, with anything. That's the way to do it. So, or as Stephen Covey was saying, the author, saying, you need to learn everything twice, and the best way to learn it is to teach it, because of course by the time you teach it, then you've got to spell it out. And this is a little bit where the title of the book came in, and I like the eureka moment, which is when you come up with something new. It's like you burst into a new scene, and it's this obvious in hindsight but invisible in foresight. That's the whole events that happens with forward plane. But we'll come back onto that, because at the moment it's this is something we can come back to. So where I wanted to get to next, and that will be the end of this first presentation, is so I was starting to get good at my job. I was this new job, and I was being very disciplined with building the forward plane and the rest of it. And then it occurred to me that there's something else that happens, because you see, when you do backplane to forward plane, then essentially you bring things, you bring things along and fine, so it's like making a duplicate. But I started to notice that I was getting better at working out implications, and this is one of the first secrets, if you want, a forward plane. And this is actually really, really quite important, because backplane to forward plane transfer, you do the same thing. Okay, so if you take a metaphor of playing a musical instrument, well, you hear some. I like the guitar, so you hear some tune, and then you're able to play them. Yeah, I'm not that good that I can do that, but let's imagine. But implications is when you go like, well, what about if I do this? So you start riffing off. So you start to get something for nothing, and so not only are you a better colleague, a better employee, a better supplier for your customers, a better advisor, but also you start to really you start to get new things coming into mind, and this is really quite surprising. So if it happens once or twice, you go like, well, who cares? But if it happens a lot, then you start to become quite impressive. So here I've got a whole a list of forward plane building tools, and the first ones are lists. So like anyone who's done a shopping list will know what will know the principle. When you write your shopping list, by the time you get to the shop, half the time you don't. Well, first of all, the chance of forgetting something is much less. Second, sometimes as you're doing it, new things come to mind. You go, oh yeah, what about this? What about that? And then thirdly, by the time you get to the store, sometimes you don't even need the shopping list because you've kind of crystallized it in your mind. Now, this is nothing new. This is not something we're inventing. Yeah, this is something we're describing, we're observing, and we're deriving the consequences. So lists are great, and they do certain things, but the problem with lists is that it's a sequence, and there's particularly for things like works, there's some limitations to what you can do in terms of representing causality or sequences or the rest of it. So and we'll understand a little bit more why we say that later. So the second item is general prose. So general prose is a bit like lists, but you start to have to link things logically. So you can't simply just plonk elements. You've got to say, well, this happens, there's a sequence, and then that happens, and because of that, you also have that, or this leads to that, or this happened before that, and so on and so forth. So prose is far more powerful, but but equally it's a little bit more constraining. So if you need to change anything in a text, then you need to go back and rearrange the sentences, and maybe something you had preambled and no longer makes sense, and the rest of it. So these are the shortcomings of prose compared to lists. Then you got mind maps. Now mind maps are good because you're not trapped in a sequence, so you can always add things. I'm not a huge fan of mind maps, but I know some people who are, and I know some people who do very well with them, so they definitely go there. What I am a fan of is what I call process maps. So essentially you just do block diagrams and you put arrows. So it's not dissimilar to mind maps, but there's more sequence. Okay, so it's not organized as a hierarchy necessarily, but there's either the sequence of either causality or timeliness is implied in there. And so process maps I love. So lists can be great to get going, and then process maps with boxes and arrows for me are, they're one of the top things. The other thing is that there's graphical components, and I love graphical components. Whiteboards, I love whiteboards. They're not very portable. I use them with lots of colored pens. For some reason, I do not like black pen on colored boards, on whiteboards. It's a color or a non-color I just don't like. But I use all the other colors, and they're great. The only thing is that they're not particularly private, and they're not particularly portable. So that's some of the shortcomings. But in terms of structure, you can rearrange, you can adjust, you can, and by the time you've looked at a process and you've done 2 or 3 mind maps, and well, there you go. Sequence diagrams on a whiteboard or otherwise, you are far more advanced into a topic than you would be otherwise. Felt cards and pens. So these are really good, for instance, for doing storyboards or to plan a document when you don't want to be trapped in a sequence, and then there are lots of gaps and you don't feel it. So they do that very well. It's quite cheap. It's quite portable. So I use them a lot. And then simply sharing. You talk to people, and then So strictly speaking, that's not quite forward plane. In the sense of, okay, well, so that's an interesting one. So one of the key aspects of forward plane is, in terms of building it, has got to do with writing. Now, it's a long discussion topic, and it might be a little bit contentious in some areas. I don't think it's that contentious, but I understand that people would go like, well, how do you know, or what about this? Well, a fair amount of whataboutism and the rest of it. But generally, I believe that writing things down is the key to building forward plane. And that's supported by a number of reasons, number of factors, if you want, behind that. And the first one is I've seen it working in practice, both for myself, but lots of people around me. So it's fairly easy. So for instance, when people say, oh, this person is an expert or whatever, they say, well, he's written the book. And it's because the act of writing, such as I understand it, the act of writing slows down the mind enough. It's you tread on the spot for long enough that it creates a chemical imprint in your mind. Now, why this is the case, I believe it's pure happenstance, but that's just what happens, particularly with the Greek alphabet, the Western character set, I believe. Now, other character sets, other alphabets, other techniques or whatever, I know much less about them, and so I don't have any strong views on these. I'd love to learn. In fact, it'd be interesting to have a comparative study, but it's not particularly relevant for our case here. What is relevant is the fact that writing with the Western character sets, the Western style of writing, the Western sentence constructs, is a lot slower than talking or thinking or reading or listening, and it makes you stand on the spot such that it creates an imprint. So does that mean that as soon as you've written something, the forward plane has been built? Well, actually no, and that's the interesting thing about that, is that normally it takes a few hours, or maybe the next day, or maybe more, and a few repetitions, but gradually. So if you take a poem that you can listen to, you go, okay, it's a lovely poem, but then if you got to, or the lyrics of a song, but then if you've got to be able to recite it, if you're going to be able to go through it, repeat it yourself, well, it helps to write it down, and it helps to, or any piece of knowledge, and have a few repetitions, and it takes a little bit of time, you see. So that's one thing. The other thing, the other factor that supports the the theory, I believe, about development forward plane, is that if you look at history, when writing was invented, looking at the Western Europe kind of strand, because there were other strands, and again, I don't know enough about those, but certainly the Sumerians, as far as the Western world are concerned, were the first ones with writing, with the cuneiform writing on clay tablets, and they were able to administer an empire. And then the next big events that I can see would be the Egyptians with the hieroglyphics, and they were starting to use papyrus. So instead of writing on clay, papyrus gives you a lot more space and a little more portable, and they had more characters and the rest of it. So and then you had the Phoenicians and the Greeks. So I think what seems to have happened is the Phoenicians took some of the characters from the Egyptians and then used phonetics to represent consonants, and then all the Greeks did, again, as far as I understand, is they took the Phoenician consonant alphabets, and then they added vowels, and then a full language was formed. And we know that each of these cultures in their own time really completely expanded and blew out any prior knowledge, any prior, whether it's scientific or architectural or administrative, or what they were all able to do. And then of course the Greeks in terms of philosophy, in terms of mathematics. I mean, Euclid's Elements in mathematics is 13 books of mathematics, which even to this day is quite heavy. I think for most people they would have to work some to go through all the concepts, the arc, algebra and calculus and geometry and the rest of it. So what the Greeks did, what you can see, I mean, this supports, it doesn't prove, but it really supports the idea that writing does something very, very specific. And so I don't want to go on too much for this first one. There's plenty of material in the book on that, so it's but one of the key thing about forward plane is that once you start to build it, so you do this backplane to forward plane transfer, is that you start to see implications, and that's where you start to get something for nothing. Okay, this is when you start to have additional stuff, and that is a tremendous moment. I mean, this is groundbreaking stuff, because I remember being with my clients and having discussions, and then about new product or something like that, and then with the teams or with the user groups, and these ideas would come to mind, and in a way which was far superior to what I would have had in the past. So you build, and that was purely out of being diligent of in terms of doing backplane to forward plane transfer, which is tremendously simple and doesn't cost much, and is completely for a lot of jobs, maybe not all, but for many jobs or studies, it's highly it's fairly relatively easy to integrate with your work. So already, so we're going to come. I'm going to bring it to a close here. So already you can see that having these two systems way and then of a backplane and forward plane and looking at things differently, then we can start. We can start looking at a different mechanism and looking at potential that a lot of people are not using the potential to the full. Some are, but it's interesting. So we've covered about a third of this first book, and so I'll try and come up with the next video as soon as I can, really, in the coming days or weeks. And thank you for your attention.